At my sister's award gala, she thanked me from the stage for being her first lesson in what happens when brilliance never learns to ship. The room laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to tell me they had already decided what kind of story they were in. That was the real danger, not the joke itself. The speed with which it fit the version of me everyone in that ballroom had been prepared to accept. The event was being held in the atrium of the Sutherland Center in downtown Seattle, all glass walls and engineered light, with a stage built over a reflecting pool that had been drained and covered for the night. Screens on both sides of the room looped a sleek promo reel for LuminaOS, the operating platform my younger sister Chloe was about to be honored for, redefining secure civic infrastructure. Waiters moved through the room with trays of sparkling water and neat square appetizers nobody actually wanted. Investors stood in little half circles, men in dark jackets and women in expensive shoes, each group holding the same kind of posture, interested, selective, already deciding whether the person in front of them deserved a follow-up breakfast. Above the stage, a white banner carried the name of the foundation giving the award. Below it stood my family. My father, Marcus Vance, in the same kind of midnight suit he wore whenever he wanted a room to assume competence before he had said a word. My mother, Vivian, silver at the wrists and throat, composed enough to make grief or pride look equally tailored. And Chloe, in a pale ivory gown with a clean neckline and a microphone in one hand, standing under a spotlight like a woman born already translated into publicity. I was seated at the far edge of the room, not at the family table, and not quite with the engineering team. Table 38, beside two early-stage founders from Portland, and a venture attorney whose name I had already forgotten by the time dessert arrived. Whoever placed me there had understood the mechanics of humiliation well, not visible enough to be included, not distant enough to disappear. Chloe smiled into the lights, let the last of the laughter settle, and then shook her head as if she had said something affectionate instead of precise. "My sister, Elena," she said, looking directly toward my table now, "taught me very early that genius without execution is just loneliness with a keyboard." Another ripple of laughter. Someone at my table glanced at me, then away. That was when I knew the line had been tested before tonight. Not word for word, maybe, but in spirit. The room did not react like it had heard something surprising. It reacted like it had been given permission to enjoy a version of me already floating in the background. I did not stand. That mattered. People who have known me only through Chloe's stories, my parents' introductions, and the occasional article that quotes her calling LuminaOS a civic operating layer built for trust, expect one of two things from a woman like me. Either a dramatic exit, which confirms instability, or frozen composure, which they mistake for irrelevance. I had spent too long in rooms like that to offer either one quickly, so I stayed where I was, one hand around the stem of my water glass, and let the moment show me what it had come to prove. My name is Elena Vance. I was 35 that spring, and by then most people in that room believed they knew exactly what kind of woman I was. The older sister. The difficult one. Technically gifted but impossible to scale. The one who liked systems more than people. The one who had once built elegant things and then disappeared into private research, consulting contracts, and small, unmarketable work that did not fit neatly into magazine profiles. Chloe, by contrast, had become legible. She knew how to talk to investors without sounding hungry. She knew how to stand in front of a white screen full of diagrams and make everyone believe complexity was simply confidence in a better dress. She knew how to make a platform feel inevitable before it had even survived a hostile audit. Most importantly, she knew how to perform progress in a way our parents had always admired. My family has never loved the thing itself as much as they love the room that forms around the thing. My father spent 30 years in enterprise systems integration and raised both his daughters on two commandments he never phrased directly: make it scalable and make it legible to power. My mother, who once ran donor strategy for an arts foundation, believed presentation was not vanity, but respect. Between them, they built a household in which visible fluency counted as seriousness and private depth counted only if someone else could package it in time for dinner. Chloe fit that world beautifully. I did not. Even as children, the difference between us had less to do with intelligence than with translation. Chloe could explain a half-formed idea and leave the room excited about it. I could build the thing itself and still sound, in my father's words, prematurely attached to the plumbing. He did not mean it cruelly. That was part of the problem. In families like mine, the sentences that do the most damage are often delivered as clarification. Elena is the back-end child. Chloe is the interface child. One builds, one leads. By the time we were adults, those labels had hardened into identity. The story my family told about me was never that I lacked ability. That would have been too easy to disprove. It was subtler and therefore stronger. Elena was brilliant, yes, but private. Deep, but impractical. Rigorous, but not built for leadership. The kind of woman whose mind people admired most at a distance, after someone else had translated it into something presentable. That was why Chloe's line landed so cleanly in the room. It did not invent anything. It activated an architecture already in place. The award tonight was for LuminaOS, Chloe's flagship platform, an operating system pitched as a secure municipal coordination layer for schools, clinics, permit offices, and local infrastructure. The press material called it Trust Architecture for Public Systems. Investors called it Scalable Civic Tech. The foundation giving the award called it a once-in-a-generation tool for transparent governance. And as Chloe stood there smiling under white light, accepting applause for what she described as 5 years of fearless iteration, every screen in the ballroom pulsed with visual motifs I recognized in my bones. The compositional logic, the layered permissions hierarchy, the quiet symmetry of the system diagrams, the stripped-down kernel map hidden in the transitions between public-facing animations, not copied carelessly, copied intimately, copied by someone who had lived close enough to the work to mistake access for authorship. At the edge of the stage, behind the foundation director and 2 city officials, I could see Adrian Bell from product, Nora Tsai from deployment, and 3 engineers from Chloe's public team. Competent people, tired people. The kind of people who know when a platform is sound, when it is patched, and when it is being asked to carry a story larger than its underlying integrity can support. None of them were smiling. That mattered too, because if tonight had only been about family humiliation, I would have left. But there was another clock running underneath the applause. At 9:30, after the speeches and donor photos, LuminaOS was scheduled for its closed-door live governance demo upstairs for a group of municipal partners and institutional investors. Chloe had been promoting it for weeks as the first fully integrated public systems launch environment. Her team believed they were about to move from prestige into dominance. What they did not know, what my sister did not know, what my father certainly did not know, and what my mother had never once asked enough questions to discover, was that the system core they were about to demonstrate could not complete live production validation without the original author path, not because I had sabotaged it, because I had built it correctly. Foundation architecture is rarely dramatic. It does not explode. It does not announce betrayal. It simply refuses to pretend a structure is sound when the people using it do not understand what holds it up. Chloe kept speaking. Something about impact, about stewardship, about building for trust in a time of institutional exhaustion. Then she thanked our parents for teaching her that real builders bring other people with them. That line got applause. Of course it did. I looked at my father as he smiled up at her from the front table, and I understood with a kind of cold calm that this night had not been arranged merely to honor her. It had been arranged to formalize succession, to place Chloe visibly in the role of heir to the family story, heir to the public narrative. heir to the version of technical leadership that photographs well. And me? I was there as contrast, as caution, as proof that private brilliance without market fluency becomes social failure. What no one in that room knew yet was that a system built on stolen authorship does not collapse because the original architect takes revenge. It collapses because sooner or later the structure asks a question only the real builder can answer. When Chloe stepped back from the microphone and the applause rose around her, I saw Dr. Eris Thorne near the service entrance at the back of the room. He had not told me he was coming. He stood with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat, watching the stage with the flat stillness of a man who did not attend galas unless something underneath them had already started to crack. Then he looked at me once, and with nothing more than that look, I knew two things at the same time. He had seen enough. And upstairs, the real evening had not even begun. If you had asked my parents whether they believed in substance over presentation, they would have said yes, without hesitation. That was the first lie Elegance told in our house. Not a malicious lie, not even a conscious one, just a lie polished so often it began to feel like culture. My father admired depth as long as it could be summarized on a slide. My mother respected craft as long as it arrived with enough grace to make a room lean toward it rather than away. Neither of them would ever have said they preferred surfaces. They would have said they valued communication, leadership, visibility, polish every modern word that makes performance sound like a moral virtue. Chloe learned that language early. I learned the machinery underneath it. That was the difference between us, long before either of us knew what to call it. Our father, Marcus Vance, had spent most of his career translating complex systems for people who controlled budgets but not logic. He made a good living because he knew how to make hard things sound inevitable rather than fragile. He believed technical work had value only when it crossed the room cleanly enough for money to understand it. If something couldn't be pitched, framed, or sold into consensus, he treated it as unfinished no matter how rigorous it actually was. My mother, Vivian, carried the same instinct into social life. She was not vain in the obvious sense. She never looked foolish or loud or thirsty for attention. Her discipline was subtler than that. She believed presentation was respect, that how a thing entered a room determined whether the room would honor or dismiss it. In some contexts, she was right. In others, that philosophy rotted quietly into hierarchy. People who performed ease were trusted more quickly. People who needed time, precision, and explanation were treated as if they had already made a small social error simply by being difficult to package. Chloe fit our parents' worldview almost perfectly. Even as a child, she knew how to shape an atmosphere. She could walk into a room full of adults, make eye contact, laugh at the right moment, offer one well-timed observation, and leave everyone feeling she had brought energy rather than consumed it. Teachers loved her. Family friends remembered her birthday. Churchwomen in our Seattle neighborhood called her such a natural leader by the time she was 14. She was bright, truly bright, but her great gift was not intelligence alone. It was legibility. She made other people feel intelligent for understanding her quickly. I did not. I was not shy, exactly. That was always the wrong word. Shyness implies fear of contact. What I had was impatience with simplification. If something wasn't finished, I didn't want to present it. If a system still had unresolved dependencies, I resisted talking about it, as though it already belonged to the world. When I was 12, I took apart a household router to understand why it kept failing under load and missed dinner because I was testing heat behavior after reassembly. When I was 15, I wrote a scheduler for my school robotics team because the commercial solution they were using looked smooth in demo and failed every time constraints became real. My father called it classic Elena behavior, solving the invisible half too well and then acting surprised when nobody applauded. He didn't mean it as an insult. That was what made it stick. In our family, the most durable injuries were always delivered as neutral observations. Elena is more interested in what works than what lands. Chloe understands people. Elena builds foundations. Chloe builds momentum. Line by line, over years, those distinctions stopped sounding like personality and started becoming destiny. My father used to tell a story at dinner parties about the time Chloe gave an 8th grade presentation with no notes and had the whole room in the palm of her hand, while I, at roughly the same age, once spent 7 minutes explaining why a school project's assumptions about data input were flawed until my teacher gently suggested I save some of that passion for college. Everyone always laughed, including me for a while. That is how family mythology gets into the bloodstream. It does not always attack. Sometimes it charms. It turns your most essential traits into anecdotes and teaches you to treat your own misreading as harmless because objecting would make you look humorless. The family vocabulary hardened as we got older. Chloe was strategic. I was exacting. Chloe had presence. I had depth. Chloe could lead a room. I could build what a room would later depend on. None of those statements are insulting on their face. But hierarchy rarely announces itself openly in families like mine. It hides in which virtues get rewarded socially and which are treated as supporting infrastructure. Presence earns trust before proof. Depth is appreciated later, if at all, and often only after someone else has translated it into a usable narrative. By our 20s, this had become structural. Chloe interned at high-visibility accelerators, learned venture vocabulary the way some people learn a second religion, and developed an instinctive feel for what powerful people wanted to hear when they were investing in a future they did not actually understand. She did not fake expertise. She absorbed just enough of everything to move fluidly between engineers, operators, and donors. She became the kind of person people invited back because she left them feeling momentum rather than complexity. I moved the other way. Distributed systems, security architecture, kernel design, the kind of work that strips ego fast because code either survives load or it doesn't. I loved invisible integrity. I loved the part of systems that no one sees when the thing is working and everyone suddenly notices only when it fails. To me, that wasn't support work. That was the work. The rest presentation, scaling stories, investor language, felt derivative. Useful sometimes, dangerous often. My parents were proud of both of us, in theory. In practice, they understood Chloe better because her achievements entered the room in familiar shapes. An internship at a known company, a profile in a startup publication, a conference appearance. A founder photo with clean lighting and language that made ambition sound civic. My work moved differently. Long hours, private prototypes, white papers, internal security reviews, consulting contracts with names I often couldn't share. It looked like absence to people who measured contribution by visibility. By the time Chloe began publicly attaching herself to LuminaOS, my parents were already primed to believe a story in which she had become the natural public architect of something too complex for most people to verify directly. That is what made the Gala so dangerous. Not that it honored my sister, that it completed a story my family had been writing for years. Chloe, the visible inheritor. Elena, the cautionary contrast. If anyone in that room wondered how a younger sister could so easily stand under a spotlight and joke about an older sister's brilliance without execution, the answer was simple. She had been trained by a household that treated presentability as proof of readiness and depth, as a private resource someone else might later need to frame. None of this made Chloe evil. That distinction matters. She was not a cartoon villain built from envy and theft. She was worse, in a more realistic way. She was a person who had spent so long being rewarded for symbolic fluency that she no longer heard the moral difference between access and authorship as clearly as she should have. My parents had done that. The market had done that. And, for a while, I had helped do it too. Because if you spend years building the lower architecture while someone beside you learns how to narrate the upper floors. Eventually, the house itself begins to look like it belongs more naturally to the voice people hear echoing through it. That was what the room at the gala believed. That Chloe had built what I had merely failed to scale. What they did not understand, what my family had never really respected because they had never really been forced to, was that core architecture is not a mood, not a style, not a founder myth. It is sequence, permission, integrity, and survival under pressure. And upstairs, less than an hour away, LuminaOS was about to be tested in the only language that had ever mattered to me. Not applause, not charisma, not investor confidence. Reality. I did not become invisible by accident. I became invisible because I was useful in ways that did not photograph well. That is an important distinction. People often talk about overlooked daughters as if they were simply quieter, sadder, or easier to neglect. That was not my story. I was not naturally self-erasing. I was precise. Demanding, sometimes. Restless with half-finished thinking. I asked hard questions too early and insisted on technical honesty long after everyone else preferred a cleaner narrative. In most families, that would have made me difficult around the edges. In mine, it made me ideal for a certain role, the one who builds the underlying structure and then gets reframed as temperament the moment someone else learns how to stand on top of it. By the time I was 23, I had stopped expecting my parents to understand what I loved. They admired intelligence in the abstract, especially if it came with awards, press, or the kind of speech that made rooms relax. What I loved was not intelligence as performance. I loved systems under stress. I loved the place where elegant ideas became ugly, necessary decisions, permission layers, failure states, recovery logic, identity trust under hostile conditions. The part of technology most people only encounter when something breaks and suddenly the surface no longer matters. I went to Stanford for graduate work, then dropped out of the doctoral track 2 years in because I realized I wanted to build more than I wanted to publish. My father called that a classic Elena turn, meaning brilliant, unfortunate, impossible to summarize to people who mattered. My mother tried to soften it by saying I had always been ahead of conventional structures. Chloe, who was already circulating beautifully through founder dinners and accelerator weekends by then, only said, "You'll do better once you decide whether you want to make things or make impact." I remember looking at her across my mother's kitchen island and thinking, not for the last time, that some people speak in binaries because the middle is where other people's labor disappears. I moved into a basement apartment in Fremont after that. 1 bedroom, low ceilings, terrible natural light, and enough room for 2 monitors, a standing desk built from reclaimed wood, and the kind of silence I needed when a system was still raw enough to be honest. The place was unimpressive in every way that mattered to my family, and perfect in every way that mattered to me. I could work until 2 in the morning without performing progress for anyone. I could test kernel behavior under simulated municipal load patterns and leave diagrams half-finished on the wall without worrying how they looked to visitors. I could build ugly first versions and refine them until the elegance belonged to function instead of presentation. That was where Aletheia began. Not LuminaOS. Aletheia. The name I never intended to pitch publicly until it deserved the risk. At first it was a private architecture problem I couldn't stop circling. What would a civic operating environment look like if it were built from the inside out for integrity rather than for investor reassurance? Not another dashboard. Not another layer of branded coordination software pretending to solve institutional mistrust through visual cleanliness. I wanted something deeper, an operating framework that assumed public systems were fragmented, politically pressured, technically uneven, and constantly at risk of being accessed by people who valued visibility more than governance. Aletheia was designed around 3 convictions. That identity should be verifiable without becoming easily exploitable. That permissions should be legible at the deepest layer, not just in the interface theater shown to administrators. And that deployment should never rely on symbolic confidence when structural trust was missing. That last conviction would matter later more than anyone in my family understood. At the time, though, it was just the way I built. I consulted to pay rent, security reviews, architecture cleanup, short-term systems repair for mid-size firms whose public platforms were cleaner than their underlying logic. I was good at that work because I didn't care about flattering the people who had signed the contract. I cared whether the system would survive pressure once they started lying to themselves about readiness. Companies disliked me at first and often hired me again. My notes were too sharp for comfort and too accurate to ignore. If you had looked at my life from the outside then, you would not have seen the kind of success my sister knew how to convert into status. No TED stage. No founder press. No polished launch photos. Just code, notebooks, whiteboard fragments, consulting invoices, and a project no one knew existed outside a very small circle. My parents interpreted that as drift. They never said failure. They were too sophisticated for that. Instead, they used words like hidden, private, hard to place, which in our family always meant morally unconvincing. Chloe once told a friend in front of me that I was the kind of genius who could build a cathedral and forget to put in the front door. Everyone laughed. I did too, at the time. Not because it was true, but because I was still making the mistake of believing my own participation in the joke reduced its power. It didn't. Jokes are often just family doctrine wearing a brighter shirt. What nobody in my family really understood was that my work was not unshipped because I was afraid of the world. It was unshipped because I did not trust the world enough yet. That is a different thing. A system intended for public infrastructure cannot be treated like a lifestyle product. You do not push it live because the market is excited. You do not wrap an unfinished governance layer in beautiful language and call it visionary. You do not let charisma outrun control and hope the moral frame will survive the technical one. That was the split between Chloe and me in its purest form. She believed momentum could pull architecture forward. I believed architecture had to earn the right to be trusted before momentum touched it at all. Neither position sounds monstrous on paper, but put them in one family, under two parents who already preferred legibility to depth, and eventually the difference becomes inheritance. I built Aletheia over 5 years in increasingly refined iterations, small private test environments, controlled municipal simulations, authentication pathways, integrity layers, recovery structures. No public deck, no big reveal, just the work. And because it was quiet, because it lived below the layer of social understanding my family could easily honor, it became easy for them to imagine that whatever I was doing was somehow adjacent to real impact, instead of the foundation from which real impact would later have to grow. That misreading became the opening Chloe needed. Not because she lacked intelligence, she had plenty. Because she had spent her entire life in a house that taught her the thing people see first is often treated as the thing that matters most. By the time she asked to look at some of my architecture work, just to understand how you think, I had already made one fatal error. I had spent too many years assuming that being underestimated was safer than being visible. It isn't. Sometimes invisibility is simply pre-theft. And sometimes the first people who learn how much you've built are the people best positioned to turn access into a story where you no longer sound essential at all. Chloe did not steal Aletheia in one dramatic act. That is important. If what happened between us had involved passwords broken in the night, shadowy intrusions, or some cartoon version of betrayal, it would have been easier to name and easier for other people to condemn. Real theft inside families is usually slower than that. It grows in the space between access and entitlement, between admiration and appropriation, between the person who built the thing and the person who has spent her whole life being rewarded for sounding like the natural public owner of anything she can describe smoothly enough. By the time she came to me, Chloe had already been through 2 startup disappointments and 1 very polished, near success. The first company was a workplace culture analytics tool that had more language than utility. The second was a civic engagement app that looked beautiful in demo and never found sustained adoption outside pilot programs where people were paid to care. The near success was a data coordination product for regional nonprofits that got just far enough into funding conversations for magazine people to start calling her one to watch before the whole thing sagged under the weight of weak back-end design and overpromised interoperability. She knew how to get rooms interested. She had not yet learned how to build something that survived once the room got what it wanted and moved on. When she started calling me more often, I recognized the pattern before I trusted the intent. It always began with humility when Chloe needed something real. Not fake humility, she was too sophisticated for that. More like a temporary lowering of theatrical brightness. She would ask thoughtful questions, listen longer, let silence stay in the room a little more than usual. It was the closest thing she had to seriousness. One Sunday afternoon, she came to my apartment in Fremont carrying expensive coffee and wearing the kind of neutral clothes wealthy founders adopt when they want to look like they no longer care how much their clothes cost. Cream sweater, dark jeans, hair tied back. No photographer, no polished angle, no visible urgency. Just my younger sister standing in the doorway looking tired enough that some old and undisciplined part of me softened before I had fully decided to. "I need help thinking," she said. That, in my experience, is one of the most dangerous sentences intelligent people ever use on family. Not because it is dishonest, because it can be true and still become a doorway to something ruinous. I let her in. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee between us and the city fading gray outside the basement windows. She talked first about market timing, civic distrust, fragmented public systems, procurement inefficiencies, and the exhaustion local agencies were under after years of patchwork digital modernization. The language was familiar. It was also, annoyingly, not wrong. That was always Chloe at her most effective. She could stand close enough to reality that objecting to her too early made you sound petty. Then she said, "I know you're building something deeper than what anyone else is even trying." I should have ended the conversation there. Not because praise is always manipulation, because in our family, praise from the visible child often arrived only when the invisible child had finally produced something the visible child might be able to stand near. I asked what she wanted. She said, "I want to understand how you think about integrity at the system level. Not to take it. I know how that sounds. I just—" She paused, and for once the pause didn't feel staged. "I'm tired of building beautiful things that stop being beautiful once people actually use them." That sentence got past my defenses more than flattery would have, because it was, in a way, the truest thing she had ever said to me. For the next several weeks, our contact increased. Not daily, not with the frantic intensity that would have triggered my suspicion immediately, regularly enough to normalize itself. Shared meals, whiteboard sessions, technical questions framed as curiosity rather than extraction. She never asked to see the whole system all at once. That, too, mattered. People who know what they're doing around ownership rarely grab. They orbit. They ask for one layer, then another. One concept, one module, one architecture note. One decision rationale. Nothing that sounds individually unreasonable. I still had boundaries, or I believed I did. I showed her principal layers, not full-stack implementation. Permission logic, not full deployment sequencing. Governance maps, not the deepest live validation pathways. Enough to explain why most civic tech products were shallow. Enough to show the elegance of a system built from trust architecture instead of user interface seduction. Enough, I thought, for my sister to finally understand why I built the way I did and maybe, if the world was feeling generous, enough to create a cleaner relationship between us than the one our parents had spent decades teaching. That was my mistake. I kept misreading access as intimacy. Chloe was brilliant at making proximity feel mutual, even when its value flowed in only one direction. There were signs, if I'm honest. The way she repeated my phrases back later in investor-ready language that sounded almost identical in thought and completely different in intention. The way she would say things like, "People need an entry point for truth," when what I had actually said was that public systems need deep integrity before they deserve trust. The way she never seemed especially interested in the private discipline of the work, only in the places where that discipline could become narrative. Once, after I spent 20 minutes explaining why creator-authenticated governance mattered in core deployment layers for public infrastructure systems, she leaned back in her chair and said, almost to herself, "That's the story." I corrected her immediately. "No, that's the architecture." She smiled. "Architecture is a story if you ever want anyone to fund it." I remember the sentence because it annoyed me more than it frightened me. At the time, that still felt like a disagreement about philosophy. Not a warning. My mentor, Eris Thorne, noticed before I did that something had shifted. Eris was one of the few people in my life who could tell the difference between my silence when I was concentrating and my silence when I was tolerating an intuition I didn't want to formalize yet. He had spent most of his career building deep systems nobody outside the room ever fully understood and had the exact kind of intelligence that gets less interested in spectacle every year it survives institutions. We were having dinner in a quiet place near the water when he asked, without preamble, "Why is Chloe suddenly asking such good questions?" I looked up from my plate. "She's trying to build something more serious." He nodded slowly, then said, "Or she's trying to stand close enough to seriousness that the room stops asking who built what." I said he was being unfair. He said, "No, I'm being old." That was Aris. He never argued longer than necessary once he realized experience had already been dismissed as pessimism. The truth surfaced in fragments after that. A phrase in a panel interview Chloe gave that was too close to one of my unpublished internal notes. A visual language in a Lumina preview deck that mapped too neatly onto an architecture model I had shown her on my kitchen wall. Then a white paper draft sent to me accidentally by a former colleague who assumed I was already consulting on the project and wrote, "This sounds more like you than her." It did. Not because Chloe had copied lazily. Because she had copied intimately. She had not taken my work as an outsider, grabbing files she could not read. She had absorbed enough from standing close to it, enough language, enough structures, enough logic maps, enough relational trust to build a public body around a system she did not fully author and did not fully understand. That is what made it so dangerous, and what made it harder to call theft in a way people like my parents would accept. Because from the outside, it looked like development, collaboration, influence, shared thinking, sisters in adjacent worlds. But beneath that cleaner interpretation was a simpler and uglier truth. Chloe had learned exactly how close she needed to stand to the architecture before she could mistake my foundations for her inheritance. And by the time LuminaOS began appearing publicly, she was already far enough inside the language of Aletheia that explaining the difference would require more than hurt. It would require structure. And structure, as I was about to learn, is always hardest to build after the room has already fallen in love with the facade. I did not discover LuminaOS in a dramatic way. No whistleblower, no midnight breach alert, no cinematic moment where 3 screens lit up and made the betrayal impossible to deny. What happened was quieter, and because it was quieter, it took me longer to trust what I was seeing. A former colleague forwarded me a draft white paper by mistake. That was all. He worked in civic procurement research and had once reviewed a security framework memo I wrote for a regional health consortium. We were not close, but we belonged to the same loose ecosystem of people who spend too much time thinking about governance, digital trust, and the humiliating gap between how public systems are described and how they actually behave under pressure, he sent the paper with a note that read, "Assuming this is the thing you mentioned. Strong narrative. Curious how much of the kernel you kept." I opened the attachment at my desk just after 8 on a Tuesday night. At first, I thought I was only reacting to familiarity. Not theft, familiarity. In technical work, especially in adjacent fields, that happens all the time. People converge on similar language, similar structures, similar priorities. There are only so many honest ways to talk about trust layers, governance pathways, or fault containment if you are trying to describe them clearly enough for decision makers and accurately enough not to embarrass yourself in front of engineers. I knew that. I reminded myself of it more than once as I read. Then I got to page 11. The architecture diagram there was not mine in a literal sense. The visual design was cleaner than anything I would have released publicly. The labels had been investor-proofed. The explanatory notes were polished into a cadence Chloe favored, short enough to circulate, clean enough to quote, broad enough to flatter non-technical readers into feeling they understood more than they did. But underneath the presentation were relationships no one arrives at accidentally if they are building from a different base. A staggered permission lattice with deferred validation. A nested civic identity model built around trust collapse rather than trust assumption. A core integrity pathway hidden beneath the public orchestration layer in exactly the place I had once shown Chloe on my kitchen wall when she asked me why most municipal tech failed even when the user flows looked beautiful. I sat back in my chair and stared at the page for a full minute before turning to the next one. By page 16, I had stopped trying to reassure myself. The problem was not that Chloe had borrowed my general thinking. It was that she had built LUMINA's public language around architecture decisions she had only been close enough to understand because I had let her stand there. Some phrases were almost intact in spirit, if not wording. Places where I had spoken clumsily and privately about how public systems should never pretend trust where governance isn't deep enough to enforce it, had been transformed into lines like "Lumina embeds trust." Institutions have historically outsourced it to hope, elegant, quotable, public-facing, and beneath that elegance sat structural echoes too specific to dismiss. She had not stolen Aletheia as a complete body. She had done something more intelligent. She had taken enough of its organizing logic to build a system that could wear legitimacy long before it deserved it. I called her that night, not because I thought she would confess, because some part of me still believed family proximity might produce a smaller truth before a larger one became necessary. She answered on the fourth ring, warm and slightly distracted, as if she were in a car between dinners. "Elena," I said, "I read the Lumina white paper." A beat. Then, okay. No surprise, no confusion, just a small recalibration in her voice, like a person adjusting her footing after a floor shifts exactly as she expected it might. I asked, "How much of the core architecture are you planning to pretend is yours?" Silence. Not long. Long enough. When she finally spoke, her tone had lost its softness. "That's not a fair question." "It's a precise one," she exhaled. "You are not the only person in the world thinking about civic trust architecture. That would matter more if your system didn't mirror decisions I walked you through. You walked me through principles," she said, "not product." That sentence did more damage than an outright denial would have. Because it contained the exact moral slippage she had been building toward all along. Principles. As if core architecture were decorative philosophy. As if the lower logic of a system were somehow less real than the market-facing body built on top of it. As if standing close enough to a foundation gave a person the right to pour a visible structure over it and call the result authorship. I said, "You don't understand the system deeply enough to carry it live." She laughed softly then, not mockingly, not kindly either. "There it is," she said. "That's what people mean when they say you'd rather be right than useful. People, not she. People, which told me immediately this wasn't just Chloe rationalizing to herself. This was family language, market language, the old vocabulary repurposed for a bigger room. I asked her directly whether my code, diagrams, or private design notes had been used in Lumina's development. She answered like a lawyer trained by polished founders and permissive parents. Lumina is its own platform, built by a real team, led through real execution. If some of your earlier thinking helped me sharpen what a viable civic product might require, that's influence, Elena. Not theft. Influence. The same word families use when they want the benefits of another person's labor without the moral burden of naming dependence. I ended the call before I said something I would later have to explain to people committed to misunderstanding tone more than content. Then I did what I should have done before calling her. I began assembling structure, not for revenge, for clarity. Commit history from my private repositories. Old diagrams dated months before Chloe's first Lumina press mention. Encrypted backups of architecture notes. Server access logs from the period when I had temporarily granted her mirrored read access to non-production layers so she could understand the conceptual flow. That access became the center of everything. Because I had not been foolish enough to hand her the whole system, but I had been trusting enough to let her observe more than she should have. She had not broken in. She had entered through the oldest breach in family history, being welcomed near a thing by the person who built it. When I finally confronted my parents, they behaved exactly as I should have expected, and exactly as some damaged part of me still hoped they might not. My father listened for 12 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "If Chloe built a viable company from ideas you were still sitting on, maybe the distinction matters less than you think." My mother said, "There is a difference between influence and ownership, Elena, and you have always had a tendency to confuse personal intimacy with legal territory." There it was. Not shock. Not outrage on my behalf. Translation. Again, always translation. The family turning structure into tone, authorship into intensity, violation into interpersonal complexity. I understood then that I was not dealing with a misunderstanding that facts would clear up. I was dealing with a narrative machine, one that had been trained for years to assign Chloe fluency and me over-attachment, Chloe leadership and me depth, Chloe execution, and me the sadness of unfinished brilliance. By the time LuminaOS began attracting foundation attention and municipal pilot interest, the public body of the theft was already standing. What Chloe had taken was not only architecture. She had taken sequence. She had gotten to the room first. And if I wanted truth, I was going to need something stronger than accusation. I was going to need the one thing my family had spent my whole life teaching me not to rely on unless someone else respectable brought it in behind me. Structure no one could charm into blur. I did not go to my mentor because I wanted help destroying my sister. That distinction matters. If what I had wanted was revenge, there were easier emotional routes available to me. Public accusation, legal threat. Private exposure through industry channels. Anonymous leaks designed to stain Chloe's narrative before Lumina reached the next round of institutional trust. I understood all of those possibilities well enough to reject them. Not because I was morally above anger. I wasn't. I was furious. But fury is a poor architect. It loves collapse more than proportion, and proportion was the only thing I still trusted. So I went to Eris Thorne. Eris had once been the sort of systems thinker people quote after conferences and misunderstand for a decade. By the time I met him, he had aged out of public tech glamour and into something much rarer. He no longer needed rooms to validate the truth of what he knew. He had worked in distributed systems, critical infrastructure, governance, and safety architecture long enough to recognize when an elegant product narrative was standing on borrowed engineering and calling it vision. His office sat above a marine supply warehouse on the industrial edge of Ballard. Exposed brick, too many books, two whiteboards, and windows that looked out over the gray water in a way that made every conversation feel slightly more exact. I brought my laptop, printed architecture notes, access logs, and the LUMINA white paper. He made tea, read without speaking for 27 minutes, then leaned back in his chair and asked the only question that mattered. What do you actually want? Not what am I afraid of? Not how bad is it? Not do you have a case? What do you actually want? That is one reason I trusted him. He understood that technical betrayal inside family systems becomes unreadable very quickly if you let the emotional injury define the scope of the answer. I want the structure recognized, I said. Not the brand story. Not the public version. The actual architecture. He nodded once. And what if the architecture recognizes itself before anyone else does? I remember looking at him and feeling, for the first time in weeks, that I was in a room where language still had edges. He turned the white paper toward me and tapped the deployment section. They've built a body around your logic, he said. But they're describing deployment like people who inherited access patterns without understanding why they exist. That sentence opened everything, because it named the split I had been feeling but had not fully articulated even to myself. Chloe had not stolen Aletheia whole. She had stolen enough of its conceptual and structural body to create a plausible public platform, but LUMINA's language around live governance validation was thin, evasive, too smooth in exactly the places that should have sounded more burdened. Reading it had bothered me technically before it frightened me morally. Eris was the first person to explain why. He stood, uncapped a marker, and drew 3 concentric layers on the whiteboard. Public trust systems fail in 3 places, he said. Identity, permissions, and transition. Most people obsess over the first 2 because they're visible. The third kills them because they think launch is a communications event. He pointed to the innermost ring. You built for transition. He was right. That had always been the least glamorous part of Aletheia, and the most important. I did not trust public systems to remain honest simply because their interfaces looked principled. I trusted them only if governance could survive handoff between teams, between institutions, between environments, between what a system says it is and what it can actually authorize under pressure. So I built a deep-layer integrity architecture that required creator-level or formally audited transition validation before certain forms of live production activation could occur. Not to create dependence on me, to prevent trust from being socially declared before it was technically earned. That is the kind of design most investors hate hearing about. It sounds slow, unscalable, unromantic, which is exactly why it matters. Eris reviewed the mirrored access logs I had printed and asked me to walk him through exactly what Chloe had seen, when, and in what context. We built a chronology instead of a grievance list. That distinction saved me from myself more than once. By the time we finished, the problem looked less like a personal wound and more like what it actually was. Unauthorized public advancement built on partial architectural absorption. Did you ever give her deployment privileges? He asked. No. Did she ever see the full live transition path? No. She saw governance logic diagrams and non-production relationship maps. He nodded. Then she has enough to build confidence, not enough to build legitimacy. That sentence settled somewhere deep in me. Not because it promised victory, because it restored sequence. My family had spent years teaching me that what mattered was who got to the room first, who sounded steady, who looked public enough to be treated as the natural owner of a thing. Eris returned me to the opposite truth. Ownership in systems is not aura. It is sequence, authorship, dependency, and constraint. We spent the next 2 hours examining what LUMINA's team appeared to be preparing for the upcoming live demo. Press notes suggested a production-grade governance environment. Investor language implied municipal readiness. Public materials used phrases like secure civic orchestration and trusted launch architecture. But their technical documentation, at least the version already circulating in confidence among advisors and early procurement readers, described the deepest transition layer in language too vague to reassure anyone who had actually built one. Either they've solved it privately, Eris said, or they think the launch itself will create legitimacy. I don't think Chloe knows the difference. No, he said. I think she knows enough difference to hope timing covers it. That was the first truly painful sentence he spoke all day, because it gave my sister more agency than I had wanted to grant her. A part of me had still been clinging to the possibility that she had simply mistaken access for co-authorship, that she had borrowed too much language and too much confidence, and ended up in a place she could no longer reverse without embarrassment. But Eris was older and crueler in the useful way experience makes people. She doesn't need to understand the deepest layer to know it exists, he said. She only needs to believe she can get through launch before anyone forces precision. That was the real danger. Not that Lumina was fake, that it was unfinished in exactly the place public power is most tempted to lie about. I asked him, finally, the question I had been trying not to ask all afternoon. If they try to take it live without a proper transition path, what happens? Eris set the marker down. It doesn't explode, he said. It refuses. That sentence calmed me more than anything else he could have said. Because refusal is not spectacle. It is structure holding. He explained it cleanly. Aletheia's core integrity layer was built to challenge legitimacy before certain production actions could complete if governance continuity had not been properly established through the original author path or an audited successor. Handoff, not a trap, not a weapon, a safety architecture, a system designed to prevent institutions from confusing ownership theater with operational trust. If Chloe had copied enough of the body but not the authentic transition framework, Lumina could still demo beautifully in controlled conditions. It could look stable. It could impress non-technical observers. It could even survive staged interaction. But the moment they attempted certain live production validations in a real partner environment, the core would not affirm what the story claimed. Not because I had sabotaged it, because I had built it to resist exactly this kind of false inheritance. Eris looked at me for a long moment and said, "Your job now is not to stop them. Your job is to know what you will and will not say when the system tells the truth before the family does." That was the moral center of everything, not how to expose Chloe, how to behave when exposure arrived through reality itself. By the time I left his office, I had done something grief rarely lets you do cleanly inside family betrayal. I had separated injury from method. I no longer needed a dramatic confrontation. I needed sequence, logs, authorship history, and the discipline not to become more theatrical than the people who had already mistaken surface for legitimacy. Upstairs at the Gala, less than an hour after Chloe's joke at my expense, Lumina was scheduled for its closed-door launch demonstration. For the first time since I discovered the white paper, I understood exactly what the evening was going to test. Not my patience, not my family's loyalty, the architecture itself. And architecture, unlike family narrative, does not laugh politely before it fails to recognize a lie. Once Eris named the problem correctly, everything in Chloe's public story started sounding thinner. That is one of the strange mercies of technical clarity. Once you understand the exact pressure point, the emotional fog around it begins to thin. Not disappear family injury rarely grants anything that clean but thin enough that you stop chasing every surface insult and start watching the structure underneath the room. Before that meeting, I had still been half living inside Chloe's narrative, not believing it, exactly, but reacting to it. Reacting to the panels, the interviews, the careful lines about rebuilding trust infrastructure for public institutions. The way my parents spoke about Lumina as if a public future had finally made our family legible in the right way. I was angry at the theft, angry at the joke, angry at years of being translated into the less useful sister. But anger, on its own, kept me too close to her language. Eris moved me back into mine. So the next thing I did was what I should have done earlier. I stopped listening to Chloe as a founder and started reading Lumina as a system. Not the branding, not the keynote deck, not the grant language, the underlying operational claims. Public trust systems always reveal their moral seriousness in boring places. Transition logic, permissions, inheritance, recovery behavior under contested authority. What happens when identity continuity is broken but the interface still looks calm? What happens when an institution wants a system to affirm confidence the architecture has not actually earned? That was where Aletheia had always been different. I had built the core for environments where public authority changes hands unevenly, where technical staff roll over, where contracts outlast intent, where the wrong person can look official for 6 months and still not deserve deep system affirmation. I did not believe launch should be a communications milestone. I believed launch was a governance threshold. If a system is meant to coordinate schools, clinics, public records, and local permissions architecture, then it has no right to go live simply because the room claps. It has to survive handoff. That principle sat inside the deepest layer of Aletheia like bedrock. The public-facing logic was elegant enough. Identity federation, permission lattices, service partitioning, audit visibility. Those are the parts investors can be taught to admire in broad terms. But beneath them, inside the integrity layer, I had built something more stubborn, a transition framework that challenged authority claims before certain forms of live production activation could complete. Not because I wanted permanent control. That assumption annoyed me even when Eris raised it as a technical possibility. You realize, he said, that to people like your father this will sound like a kill switch. It isn't, I said. I know it isn't. The system doesn't need to know whether the room understands that. He was right, but I still hated the framing. I had spent too many years being described as controlling simply because I did not trust appearances. So I forced myself to articulate it more precisely, as much for my own discipline as for his. The integrity layer was not designed to keep me central. It was designed to prevent unauthorized claims of continuity. There is a difference. In public systems, continuity cannot be symbolic. If a platform has been built around a foundational governance model that assumes deep authorship integrity at deployment, then you do not simply replace that with confidence and hope the municipality never notices. You must formally transfer control pathways through an audited succession architecture, or the system should refuse certain commitments until that happens. That refusal is not sabotage. It is honesty. Eris nodded when I said that, and wrote one phrase on the whiteboard. Refusal is a safety behavior. That became the line I held on to for the rest of the night. Back at the gala, after Chloe's speech and the applause and the polished cruelty disguised as sisterly wit, I slipped out briefly to one of the upper corridors overlooking the atrium. Through the glass, the event below looked almost harmless, investors in dark suits, city officials pretending not to be flattered by foundation attention, my parents angled toward people who mattered, Chloe moving through clusters of admiration with exactly the energy she had trained for since she was young, never rushed, never needy, making everyone feel as if being seen by her also reflected well on them. But above that polished motion ran another schedule. At 9:30, the demo, private upstairs room, municipal observers, foundation representatives, 2 major institutional backers, a live governance environment staged to show Lumina integrating identity, access, and service authorization across multiple mock public systems at production threshold. That wording came directly from the internal schedule packet I had obtained through a technical contact who assumed I was already in the room as an advisor rather than a wound. I read the launch notes twice in the corridor. Then a third time. The team had clearly built a viable shell. More than a shell, actually. Lumina was not fake. I refuse lazy moral satisfaction, and one of the disciplines I've had to build into myself over the years is refusing to overstate what is wrong, simply because understatement was once used against me. Chloe had assembled real talent around her. Adrian Bell understood product risk. Nora Tsai was serious. The engineering team had competence. The interface environment was probably clean. The orchestration layer likely worked well enough in contained conditions. That was exactly what made the situation dangerous. Fraud is easy to dismiss. Partial structural truth wrapped in overstated legitimacy is much harder. The part that mattered most, however, was buried in one line near the end of the launch sequence. Final civic authorization handshake, initiated in live trust mode. That line told me everything. Either they had solved the transition path through a valid successor architecture without my knowledge, which I considered technically possible but operationally unlikely, or they did not understand what was required at the deepest layer and believed the launch event itself would establish legitimacy by momentum. Chloe had always believed rooms could carry systems farther than systems deserved. Aletheia had been built specifically to resist that temptation. I heard someone behind me and turned to find Adrian Bell standing a few feet down the corridor holding his badge lanyard in one hand. He knew who I was. Of course he did. Anyone near the core technical history of Lumina had heard my name in some form, even if only as an annoying shadow from an earlier stage of Chloe's thinking. He did not greet me warmly or coldly, just professionally. You came. Yes. He looked through the glass toward the atrium. Tonight is not ideal. That depends on what you think tonight is for. He gave the smallest possible smile at that, the kind engineers sometimes give when someone has finally chosen the honest framing. Then he said, "If you're here to make a scene, please don't. The team doesn't deserve that." There it was again, the assumption that the greatest risk in a room like this is emotional visibility rather than structural misrepresentation. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I'm here because if you are actually initiating live trust mode upstairs, then you have a deeper problem than optics." That got his attention in a way family language never would. He didn't ask what I meant immediately. He looked at me for a long enough moment that I understood he already suspected something. Then he said quietly, "Chloe says the inheritance architecture is complete. Does she say how it was authenticated?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Silence, in technical people, often means the question has arrived exactly where the fear lives. "I'm not your enemy," I said. "That depends on what happens in the room." No, that depended on what the system already knew. Below us, applause rose again. Another photo. Another round of public congratulations. Another visible layer of the family and institutional theater my parents had always mistaken for inevitability. Adrian glanced once more at the atrium, then back at me. "If there's a failure in live trust mode," he said, carefully. "What are we talking about?" I answered with the cleanest language I had. "Not collapse. Containment." He absorbed that, not emotionally, technically. Then he nodded once and walked away toward the elevator lobby. I stood alone in the corridor after that and felt, for the first time all evening, something close to steadiness. Not because the outcome was certain. Systems fail in many ways. Rooms often misread them. But because the core truth had clarified itself beyond family narrative, Chloe's joke no longer mattered very much. My father's pride no longer mattered very much. What mattered was that a system built to refuse illegitimate continuity was about to be asked to bless one in front of people who had invested money, reputation, and public trust in not noticing the difference soon enough. And unlike daughters, unlike founders, unlike families, systems do not laugh politely when asked to authorize a lie. They either affirm structure or they don't. At 9:26, the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor and the real audience finally appeared. There were no donors up there, No church basement morality in better shoes. No family friends pretending not to watch a private wound become useful entertainment. The people entering the demo suite wore the calmer expressions of institutional risk. Municipal advisors, procurement attorneys, 2 foundation representatives, 1 state-level digital governance consultant, and 3 investors whose bodies had the particular stillness of people used to making expensive decisions in rooms that do not reward visible enthusiasm. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that the room itself had been staged to remove the appearance of staging. No black-draped theater, no artificial suspense, just a long glass conference suite overlooking the water, lit in clean bands of white, with 4 screens displaying Lumina's interface architecture in muted civic colors slate, white, blue-gray, a restrained visual language meant to imply trust without calling attention to itself. At the center table sat polished folders, notepads, and name placards. Along the far wall, 2 technical stations were already live, attended by Norat Sai and a systems engineer I recognized from one of Lumina's internal screenshots. From the outside, it looked exactly like what Chloe had been promising in every article and panel for months. Mature, measured, ready. That is what made it dangerous. I stood near the back, not hidden, not central, in the awkward category of person whose access had been tolerated because no one wanted to create a visible security issue after the gala. My name was not on the seating chart. My badge was marked guest. My father noticed me almost immediately and looked irritated enough to speak, then checked the room and decided against it. Public authority had different rules up here. He could no longer rely on familial tone to frame me without cost. That mattered. Chloe entered 3 minutes later in the same ivory dress, now with a dark blazer over it. The costume changed subtle enough to signal transition from honoree to executive, without admitting the earlier performance had been performance. She moved through the room, greeting people by name, thanking them for being there, introducing municipal partners to technical staff, laying one hand lightly on the back of a chair as she spoke so the whole scene felt calmer than it really was. My mother looked relieved to be in this room. That told me more than anything she had done downstairs. She trusted polished institutional settings more than family rooms, because polished institutional settings gave her something she understood: controlled language, respectable witnesses, the possibility that if everyone behaved well enough, the truth could be made to look optional. Chloe began exactly on time. Her opening remarks were better than I expected. That is one of the difficulties of being wronged by someone competent. They remain competent. She did not oversell. She did not use startup prophecy language or make the sort of visionary claims that immediately trigger technical contempt. Instead, she spoke about fragmentation, service burden, trust fatigue in local institutions, and the cost of forcing public workers to navigate 5 disconnected systems to perform what citizens experience as one request. It was disciplined, investor-safe, civically literate enough to flatter the public sector people in the room. Then she turned to the screens. Lumina's interface was genuinely elegant. Not because Chloe had built the deepest parts of it, she hadn't, but because she knew how to hire people who could refine a surface until it carried confidence beautifully. Identity management looked simple. Role permissioning moved cleanly between departments. A permit request triggered school transportation data, public records, flags, and district authorization logic in a way that, to non-technical observers, suggested exactly what the pitch had promised. One coherent operating environment, replacing the chaotic patchwork most local systems endure. Heads around the table began to nod. One investor took notes for the first time. The state consultant leaned slightly forward, and as I watched the room warming to the system, I felt something I had not expected. Not anger, grief. Because if Chloe had built Lumina honestly from adjacent principles, I might have admired what she was doing even while resenting the family that would still have framed her more favorably than me. The interface was not cheap. The team had talent. The product body was real enough that in another life, in a cleaner family, in a less hungry market, we might have built something important together. That possibility lasted less than 30 seconds. Then Chloe moved into the live trust sequence. Up to this point, she said, you've seen service coordination in managed conditions. The next stage is what makes Lumina genuinely municipal grade. We're initiating live trust mode with full interdomain authorization across a simulated production stack. Simulated production stack. The phrase was careful. The room did not know how careful, because what was about to happen was not a production launch in the total sense Chloe's campaign language elsewhere had implied. It was a live threshold test in a controlled but real enough trust environment to prove that Lumina could carry the governance burden it had been claiming publicly for months. For the people in that room, that distinction would be enough. If it worked, they would call it proof of readiness. If it failed, they would call it a governance problem, not a bug. Nora Tsai initiated the sequence. On the left screen, System Services entered pre-authentication alignment. On the right, the permissions lattice began resolving across departmental nodes. The visual flow was smooth, almost boring, which is exactly what good infrastructure should look like when it is working. Then the inner challenge appeared. A small clean prompt, too clean for the room to be alarmed by at first. Core transition integrity check pending. Chloe kept talking for half a sentence before she saw it. She stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. Nora Tsai typed something at her station. The prompt remained. A systems engineer moved closer to the secondary console. The state consultant's pen stopped moving. One investor glanced toward another, not with panic, but with the tiny narrowing of attention people use when a room has finally become expensive. Chloe smiled once quick, controlled. This is part of the live handshake path, she said. You're seeing the system verify governance continuity before we complete cross-domain authorization. That was not a lie. It was, in fact, the closest to the truth she had spoken all evening. What happened next was the part she did not understand deeply enough to narrate. The prompt did not resolve. It expanded. Author transition path incomplete. Formal succession authorization required. System entering containment mode. No alarms. No flashing red catastrophe. No theatrical collapse. That was the terrible dignity of good architecture under stress. It does not scream, it refuses. One by one, the live demonstration panes froze into a clean, restricted state. Permissions display grayed out. Interdomain requests parked in review. Audit trace opened automatically in the side panel with time-stamped notation indicating a governance-level integrity hold. The room did not gasp. People with real institutional risk training almost never do. But the atmosphere changed all at once. The Foundation representative closest to the screen sat back. The procurement attorney opened the folder in front of him for the first time. My father went pale in that subtle, executive way men like him do when they realize a room they believed was still social has become technical and they no longer control the grammar. Chloe stepped toward Nora. Bypass and continue in review mode, she said quietly enough that only those nearest the front could hear. Nora did not move immediately. That won't complete live trust mode, she said. Chloe lowered her voice further. Then force the inheritance layer. There are sentences that tell you, more clearly than confession, what a person never understood about the thing they claimed. Force the inheritance layer, as if continuity were a convenience setting, as if governance were a presentation obstacle, as if the deepest part of the architecture could be persuaded by momentum, authority, or embarrassment. Nora typed. The system did not yield. Instead, the audit panel deepened and repeated, more specifically this time, no validated founder path succession chain detected. Core trust cannot be affirmed. Adrian Bell, standing 2 seats behind the municipal observers, closed his eyes for half a second. He knew then what I had known in the corridor. This was not a glitch. It was a structural refusal. The room turned colder after that, not emotionally, procedurally. Questions began forming before anyone spoke them. What founder path? What succession chain? Why had no one disclosed that live trust mode depended on a deeper author validation architecture than the materials suggested? Why was a system being sold as mature municipal infrastructure now admitting, in plain text, that its own continuity logic had not been properly authenticated? Chloe looked out at the room and, for the first time all evening, seemed briefly younger than me. Not because she had failed, because the system had stopped translating for her, and in that pause, before anyone asked the first hard question, 3 people in the room turned toward me at the same time: Adrian, Nora Tsai, and Dr. Eris Thorne, who had entered quietly through the back door and now stood against the wall as if he had been expected all along by the one force in the room that still cared more about integrity than appearance. The real demo had begun. And for the first time that night, Lumina was no longer asking investors to believe a story. It was asking who, exactly, had the right to complete it. No one in the demo suite raised their voice. That was the first sign the failure was serious. In rooms built around image, noise usually appears fast. People explain, joke, reassure, reposition. Someone reaches for charm before structure can harden into consequence. But institutional rooms are different. When a system refuses cleanly enough, the room often goes quiet first, because everyone with real authority understands that the wrong sentence becomes part of the record. On the main screen, Lumina remained in containment mode. The interface still looked elegant. That was the terrible irony. Even in refusal, the system was visually controlled soft gray fields, stable panes, calm typography, no warning sirens, no dramatic red failure state, just a clear, cold line of truth. Core trust cannot be affirmed. The state digital governance consultant spoke first. What exactly is the founder path succession chain? Not angry, not accusatory, just precise. That made the question more dangerous than outrage would have been. Chloe looked toward Nora Tsai, then toward Adrian Bell, as if one of them might offer a version of the answer broad enough to preserve her standing and technical enough to satisfy the room. Neither did. My father, who had recovered some color but none of his earlier ease, stepped half a pace forward and said, "I'm sure this is the kind of implementation detail teams can resolve after tonight." It was the sort of sentence that works at dinners. It did not work here. The procurement attorney near the center of the table did not even look at him when he replied, "If production-grade trust claims were made in the materials, then this is not an after-tonight detail." That was the moment I knew the room had crossed the line Chloe could not charm it back across. Not because they suddenly distrusted her morally. Because the system had introduced a category she had not prepared them for: undisclosed structural dependency. Chloe adjusted her blazer cuff, the smallest of her self-stabilizing gestures, and said, "Lumina uses a layered governance architecture with a legacy-authenticated transition model inherited from early conceptual development. The hold you're seeing is protective, not destabilizing." Again, almost true. That was her gift and her curse. She could stand so close to accuracy that people often mistook the gap for negligible. The consultant asked, "Inherited from whom?" And this time, there was no polite way around it. Aletheia had never been public. My name was nowhere in Lumina's press materials. The architecture history had been softened into team evolution, iterative development, and proprietary design emergence. But the system itself did not care about public simplification. It knew the difference between authorship and narration, between inherited concepts and authenticated continuity. Chloe did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough for some people in the room. Adrian Bell finally spoke. "The deepest integrity layer predates the public formation of Lumina as a product company," he said. We understood it to be internally transferable once implementation matured. You could hear the care in his wording. He was not trying to rescue Chloe. He was trying to tell the truth in a way that did not unnecessarily expose the team beneath her. I respected him for that. The consultant said, "And it wasn't?" Adrian glanced toward the screen, apparently not in the form required for live trust affirmation. The room went still again. Not shocked now. Computing. A foundation representative near the far end closed her folder and folded both hands over it. One investor began writing in the margin of his briefing packet with the flat concentration of someone already moving from excitement into due diligence damage control. My mother sat perfectly upright in her chair, looking at the screen as if composure itself might still alter the fact pattern. Dr. Eris Thorne had not moved from the back wall. That, too, mattered. He was not here to intervene dramatically. He was here because we had both known that if the architecture held, the question would eventually stop being technical and become human. Who built the thing deep enough that the system still recognized them, even after the room had been taught a different story? The state consultant looked around the room once, and then asked the cleanest question yet. Is the founder path authentication tied to a specific person? No one wanted to answer that, because once that answer existed plainly in the room, the issue ceased to be a manageable launch complication and became a governance disclosure problem. I spoke before anyone else could choose a softer lie. Yes, every face in the room turned toward me. I did not stand. I did not step forward. I had no interest in turning the moment into a performance of my own. I stayed near the back, one hand resting on the edge of a side table, and let the fact enter the room without decoration. The consultant asked, "And you are?" "Elena Vance." A beat. Then, from the front of the room, my sister said too carefully, "My older sister." Not the original architect, not the system author, not the person whose work the room had just watched the platform fail to transcend. Just older sister. Again, that instinct toward relationship instead of structure. I said, "The integrity layer requires either verified founder path succession or a fully audited transition architecture built from the original governance model. If neither exists, live trust mode won't complete." The procurement attorney looked at Chloe. "Was that disclosed in your materials?" Chloe answered more quickly this time, because speed was still her strongest defense. "We disclosed that Lumina includes deep governance safeguards and inherited architecture complexity." That sentence was not enough, and everyone there knew it. Not because it was false, because it was strategically incomplete. There is a point in every serious room where people stop asking what happened and start asking who knew what, when, and how it was described. Once a meeting crosses into that territory, charisma becomes almost useless. One of the investors turned to me and asked, "Are you saying the system cannot be launched without you?" That was the trap question. Not because it was malicious, because answering it the wrong way would let the whole room convert structural truth into personal vendetta. If I said yes too bluntly, I would become the difficult genius refusing progress. If I said no too casually, I would flatten the actual integrity issue into something cosmetic. So I answered in the only way that mattered. "I'm saying the system cannot honestly claim continuity it has not structurally earned." That did more than defend me. It returned the problem to the correct scale. This was no longer about whether I felt wronged. No longer about whether Chloe had borrowed too much language or my parents had once again preferred the visible child to the foundational one. The system had already stripped the family drama down to the one thing institutions actually care about once money and public trust are involved. Can the architecture support the claim being made about it? At the front, Nora Tsai spoke without turning around from the console. "We can keep the demo in sandbox review mode," she said. "But we cannot represent full live trust activation tonight." That sentence effectively ended the launch. No formal declaration, no disaster, just the quiet replacement of triumph with limitation. Chloe looked back at the room, and tried one final reframing. Then tonight can still show the strength of the product while we clarify the historical architecture layer. Historical architecture layer. There it was. The instinct to reduce authorship into background context, to make foundational dependence sound like a legacy note in the appendix rather than the condition of legitimacy itself. This time, even my father heard how thin it sounded, because he looked at me then not with apology, not yet, but with the unmistakable expression of a man realizing that the system had asked a question his family had spent years trying not to. Who, exactly, had built the thing they were all standing on? And worse, what else had they let Chloe stand inside because she looked more natural under light? The consultant closed his notebook.